to do a studio landscape. So this is an opportunity that I have been wanting for quite a while, to be able to show my students my process of creating a studio piece, a landscape, from both plein air sketches and photographs. So this is my process, and I teach a lot of landscape workshops, but usually it's plein air workshops that I teach, so I can show people that initial part of the process, but being able to take you all the way through to a finished studio piece is the goal of this workshop. So I'm really excited that you're joining. If you're watching later, you can watch later. You can watch this over and over, obviously, as many times as you want. So, but if you are watching now, remember that you can ask questions. We'll be stopping about every hour to answer your questions. So make sure you keep those questions coming in. But that's the goal. That's where we're going with this. And so let me start off by introducing my sources. First of all, I have my plein air sketches. And these, of course, were created from life and in Maine. So the subject that I'm going to paint is a scene from a harbor in Maine that I really loved being there. I was there with my family this summer, and these two, you notice I have a lot of sketches here. I tape them off, and I'm able to put them in my panel holders. So the goal is just to get as much color, really, from life as possible. So less and less working on one painting from life, and more just doing several. So anyway, this one in the upper left-hand corner here, and then in the lower right-hand corner, are going to be the plein air studies that I use as reference. And so one thing, I won't go into it too much, but one thing about plein air painting, so obviously this class is not about plein air painting, but one thing that's important when you think about doing these sort of sketches from life is make sure that you capture the colors, know your camera well enough so that you're capturing the colors that your camera will not reproduce very well. So these greens and purples that I was able to find in both of the studies are things that they need to end up in my final piece. So anyway, these sources. And so that, using those and the photographs that I took, now the photograph for today, I'm going to put it here. Well, let me hold it from the bottom so I don't have a shadow here. The color image is available, or you can download it on East Oak's website. So I just have a black and white printout. I think all I'll need is a black and white printout because I have plenty of color information from my plein airs. But this is the photograph. So using the plein air paintings and the photograph, I have created it's a sketch, it's rough, but it's a composition sketch over here of the scene. So there'll be a few changes, and that's one of the best, that's one of the reasons I do a composition sketch like this, is so that I can sort of live with it for a little while and analyze it, decide things to change. And so this is more or less what the finished piece is going to look like. And of course, I'll be walking through the process. So I'm working on a panel today, and it's an oil ground. It's not linen mounted to a panel, it's oil ground. And I've already toned it with my transparent earth yellow. And so this is dry. And I like to do that because I want that warmth to show through everywhere, and I don't want it mixing in with my paint. I want to be able to just paint over it. So if I wiped really, really hard with a paper towel and mineral spirits, I could get it off. So if I need to, I can, but that's pretty stable. More and more, that's my process. You don't have to do it that way. Probably a lot of you are toning your canvases just this morning if you're painting along. That's fine too. But I think that's all of the preliminary stuff. So I'm just going to get started on the painting. And a really good should actually go over my palette. So you have this list on the website, East Oak's website as well, but just so you know which is which, this is Hansa Yellow Light, Hansa Yellow Medium, Hansa Yellow Deep. Then I have Golden Ochre, Indian Yellow, Transparent Orange, Naphthol Scarlet, Alizarin Permanent, Ultramarine Blue, Cobalt Blue, Cobalt Teal, Viridian, Sap Green, Transparent Earth Yellow, Transparent Earth Red, and Chromatic Black. And this is titanium white. And I have this is sort of, if you were to take a color wheel, you can think of it as a circle, and cut it in half and stretch it out. That's what I have here. So yellow and green. That's just a good way for me to think of it, and then my earth tones down here. So that's how I set up my palette. And I'm going to get started. So I sometimes draw with pencil, sometimes draw with paint. I think of this first step as just getting the roadmap. This is where I want the composition to go, and most of the battle is already won for me because I have my composition sketch. So I'm just copying that onto, or redrawing that onto my panel. You can grid, you can use Photoshop, however you want to transfer your sketch to your larger piece. Today I'll just be drawing, and I think this horizon line is a good place to start. This is something that I will make it straighter and flatter as I go, but this is something you could even use a T-square to do. To me, this is perfectly level. And that's an interesting, so when I was in college, we did a line project. It was a design class, and horizontal lines communicate rest. So having a nice, perfectly, this is a very peaceful, restful sort of scene, and so having a perfectly horizontal line that's really dominant in the piece, something that I'm doing more and more, especially with this sort of scene. So there's that first line. And stepping back, I step back a lot when I'm working outdoors. I sort of wear down a little rut behind my easel. It's about 10 feet long and 2 feet wide. So I back up quite a bit while working. Okay. Just measuring to see where. So this right here is about halfway through. These boats, I think when they're completely rendered, I'm going to change. They're looking a little bit too much like checkers right now. And that is how they look more or less in the source, which you can see if you download it from the website at East Oaks, but a little bit too much like checkers. But I'm going to change that a little bit and compose them a little bit more. But they're going to be the center of interest, I believe. Just they're the lightest light and an intricate drawing. So my center of interest is going to be here, and then this is going to be a secondary center of interest. So saying all that, this is halfway through, and it's not the center of interest, so that's okay. Try to avoid putting my center of interest within the very center of the piece. So anyway. And this shoreline here is about halfway through. It's just easy, it's easy to find that halfway mark while you're drawing. So this is fine whether you're, I use this process working from life as well. This is the tedious part. This is the watching grass grow part of the demo. But it's important to find these, to get this placement right. Obviously, if I rush into this and I get it all wrong, my composition won't fit onto the panel the way that I want it to. So I'm not hurrying right now. So I want to get this right. This rock is a beautiful, beautiful rock. It's huge, and with my plein air sketches, I have two. They're really focused on this rock, so. Use a lot of straight lines while I'm, particularly while I'm starting. And they're easier to see, they're easier to understand. So I soften things with touch as I work through. This is the angle of the shore coming down. And it comes to right about there. Now, this right here gets a little bit confusing. So what I think we need to see here is this piece of the little harbor here needs to overlap. So it's like a little mound that's overlapping this shore here. And I think that'll make more sense perspective. So I'm just going to use my line to show that that's going to overlap. So this comes down like that. And there we go. Now that I have the beginning, I'm just going to change that a little bit. Show where this wharf is going to go. It's low tide, and low tide is just low tide at sort of that golden hour of the day is just beautiful. I can never get enough of it because all those sort of seaweeds and things that are submerged are very colorful when they're in the light, and then especially that golden light at the end of the day. They're just wonderful. So, all of these beautiful oranges. And that's why I've toned my canvas with this orange color. So I think that will, that'll show through and help me stay on track with all those colors. So there's the wharf that's in shadow. This can just paint it in. just check and make sure that I'm on track here. I think this needs to come a little farther. To be true to my sketching, it needs to come out a little bit farther. And so this probably needs to move over too. That's why I start this way. It's a forgiving way to start. And thin paint. Okay. Now I'm looking for the little piece of shore that comes out on this side. How does it compare? So it's a little shorter. And, oops. Okay. So it's be about there, but it's going to slight angle there, and then it comes up and sort of meets with this other wharf that juts out in this direction. Painting is all from the drawing to the finishing strokes. It's all, well, I should say from the first lines, it's drawing all the way through, meaning when I say drawing, I'm talking about shape. So every time you put a stroke on your canvas, you're making a shape. So it's drawing all the way through. But so from the very preliminary lines that I'm using now to the finished strokes, painting is about relationships. It's about the relationship, this distance to this distance, and the thickness of the paint and the colors and the values. It's all, it has to look right together. And it's important, especially because I know you have that photograph, and especially if you've been to the scene and you liked it, or you've been to the location and you liked it, and you have a photograph, it's easy to get carried away with I have to paint this exactly like it was. And something that you have to remember with any painting, but of course we're talking about landscape painting today, is that your painting has to stand alone. You can't, it can't be part of your plan that you're going to take the people who are going to see your painting, take them back to the place where you painted it to prove that that's how it looked, or that's where that post was, or whatever. It has to work in the painting. And actually, I recomposed the source, the photograph that you can download is actually recomposed already a little bit in Photoshop. So I already moved things around. And I like to start that way, just as much as I can do to make the scene just what I want it to be. And I have that freedom. So right now these two are lining up, which is not a good thing. And they're kind of that way in my study. I think I will move this back just a hair. That makes more sense. And it is less distracting. Try to keep things from too many shapes lining up perfectly throughout, repeating shapes. Try to avoid those, or I don't try. I aggressively avoid those. So, and they'll show up. The way that our I think it's just the way that human brains work. We're looking for patterns in the landscape. So we see a hill that goes like this, and instead of looking at the next hill and trying to understand it, our brain has already done so much work identifying this hill, we just make another hill and another hill and another hill. And so you can always tell when someone hasn't really paid attention to the landscape that they're painting, because they have these repeating shapes and patterns everywhere. And so that's one thing that will get your work looking more professional right away, is just look out for repeating shapes in the landscape. I was looking at a barn painting, or it was a painting of a barn, and it was a cloudy sky, and each cloud sort of connected to the barn at a joint, or so an angle change in the barn, so a roof or whatever, where the cloudy sky behind, the line between the sky and the clouds was right there. And you can just, those are the sort of things that sort of give away lack of careful observation. So throughout the piece, I'll be looking for those and looking to remove them. I feel like this rock needs to be a little bit taller. Step back and look at it. So just to carry on that thought, because I think it's really important, if you look at something and it, in real life, it is a repeating pattern, like the rocks are just the same or the hills are just the same, find ways to vary them. And that's, again, going back to that idea that you can't take me to the landscape and say, see, the hills are just, they're the same exact shape. You have to create a piece of art that stands alone. And so often with the landscape, people will, for instance, my wife is from Chile, and this sketch really reminded her of Chile. It's of Maine, and someone who works here is from the Pacific, here at East Oaks is from the Pacific Northwest, and this really reminded her of the Pacific Northwest. So, you know, it doesn't even have to be a specific place for someone to be interested in it. They just see what they like. So again, it has to stand alone. That's the idea there. It has to stand up. Just placing this rocky cliff on this more distant island, I think actually I like it better over here. So I'm just going to move that over. And again, you have that liberty. And this is something that it's easier to do in the studio. When you're painting from plein air, or painting from life in plein air, at least for me, I'm in such a hurry to capture the scene before the light changes completely. I'm not thinking as much about recomposing my scene. Now I know some of the, I don't really consider myself a professional plein air painter, right? So I do a lot of studio work. I do paint plein air frequently, but I do it because I need it for my studio work. So I'm different than, you know, I have friends and colleagues who, you know, they go out and they paint 3 paintings from life a day, every day, you know, and that's, you know, 45 minutes a piece. They capture the light and move on, and that's not at all, and they sell those paintings. So usually I don't sell my plein airs. It's sort of like, they're like my negatives. I don't like to part with them because they're so valuable to me in the studio. So anyway, all of that said, I don't recompose very much when I'm working from life, but in the studio I do, to make it make sense. Okay, so we have this shore here, the near shore, and this little sort of stream that flows into the ocean here comes out, and this is larger rock in the corner. And the reflection of this wharf comes down and is here. And so there's the composition. And of course I can change it throughout, but this is the roadmap. This is basically where I'm going with this piece. And so now the next thing to do is start blocking in some shapes of color. And so where to go from here? I think every time you sort of complete one process or one part of the process in your painting, there's sort of that, what do I do next? And I always tell my students, you look at the painting and you ask, what does the painting need? And if you can't decide what the painting needs, you can ask, well, what bothers me the most, and then fix that. So that's sort of the way that I break that stalemate in my own mind. So this painting needs, for me right now, it needs some of the darks that are in this landscape. And the easiest thing to see is the easiest thing to paint. And the easiest thing to paint is the easiest thing to see. It's this big shadow shape here is, which will go here. It's easy to see and easy to paint. It's sort of it's a greenish color, and I can just place that and start to build my value structure based on that. The darkest darks in my painting, in my source, I see as in here. So you can also just make an indication of that dark right now. So I know that's the values in my painting. So value is a scale from sort of black to white, right? That's the darkest value in my painting, and so I won't go darker than that. The boats are going to be the lightest, and just so I know, I can wipe this out or modify it later, but just so I know what the lightest light in my painting is, I'll just place one stroke, and that's basically in the right place. So this is not super accurate drawing yet, but lightest light, darkest dark. And the reason for doing that right away is that this is sort of, if you think of a painting, the values are, to me, value is more important than color. You can kind of invent color, you can change it, you can manipulate it, and you can do that a little bit with value, but less. Values are, if you're after representational art, they're very important for getting a sense of realism. You need accurate values. So this is the structure of my value. That's my highest. You can think the roof, and that's the basement. So I'm not going higher than the roof, and I'm not going lower than the basement. That all of my values are going to happen within these two. And in this piece, it's pretty obvious because this is almost black and that's almost pure white. So it makes sense. But if you think you're painting a nocturne where the values are very constricted, your lightest light would be just a little bit, somewhere in the mid-range. So it varies piece to piece. So depending on what you're looking at, the lightest light might not be very light and the darkest dark might not be very dark. So you need to establish that, whatever it is, in the beginning. Okay. And remember to keep those questions rolling in. looking forward to hearing what they are. So, I'm looking at my plein airs because they're the truth about color. When I first started landscape painting, I would go outside and I would paint a plein air, and then I would take photographs, intending to use the plein air as a source for a studio piece. And so I would come in with my plein air sketch and my photographs, and then I would start working on the piece, and I would see all of these colors in the photograph that I didn't have in my plein air, and I would just copy the photograph. And over the years, sort of made a rule that the plein air is like my kid, and the photograph is somebody else's kid. And if they have an argument, most of the time, unless my plein air is obviously wrong, I'm going to take my plein air side. So I try to, even if I see something in the photograph that I really like, I try to just stick to the study that I did from life, because most of the time, that'll give me a more authentic color. My goal with my studio work is to handle the colors and the values in such a way that it's not obvious ever that it was painted from a photograph. And so one of the dead giveaways that something was painted from a photograph, so one of the ways that cameras, as opposed to our eyes, get things wrong is they change the color and they change the value. So almost always there's the contrast is stronger, and blues and violets tend to be stronger in photographs, even nice photographs. So I can tell when I look at landscape paintings, if I see that, I can tell that somebody just copied a photograph. And I am zealous to avoid making those mistakes in my own work. So there you go. And so first value shape here, it looks quite dark against all of the other lights, but so I'm looking at this, as long as it's a little bit lighter than this rock over here, it's right. And that's why it's important, because if I didn't have the sort of anchors here, the highest and the lowest value, it would be difficult to determine, because it's alone here, it's isolated within a much lighter field. It'd be difficult to determine if that's the correct value. I think it's close. And the reason I think it is because I have a couple of things to compare it to. Remember, representational art, as I understand it, it's all about relationships. How do these values relate to the other values that are going in the piece? I am keeping it thin for now. I'll probably be working fairly thin throughout the day. Thicker paint tomorrow. We'll see. So now that I have that, where do I go next? I could work out from here. I could use this piece of value information to start working on the island back here. I don't have, some landscape painters are very careful to always start with the sky because it's most distant, and then, they work their way, to a distant mountain, and then to a near, and then all the way to the front. So their films of paint are in the right order for the landscape. I haven't noticed yet in my own work that really helps. It just, I tend to sort of work the whole painting at once. And it's more about the specific edge that you know, it needs to be handled in the right way so that it looks like the sky is behind the hill rather than just painting the sky first and then painting the hill over the sky. So just so you know, that's my approach. I don't have a problem with my skies looking like they're in front of the hills. So with that said, I'm going to stick to this bit right now, and then I'm going to get into that in a minute. So I'm just going to keep blocking in from right here. And added a little bit of titanium white to it, just to make it lighter. And you can, when I have these studies, it's helpful. I'll put a little dot of paint and see, oh, that needs to be quite a bit lighter. I love having already worked out the values and the colors once in a smaller piece. So I feel that allows me to be much, much more creative with this one, because I'm not, if you think of the resources of your focus and your concentration not being poured into solving all of these problems in oil for the very first time. I've already done it once, and so that gives me a little bit more ability to be creative, I think, in my texture and approach with the finished piece. So it's funny because in college, while I was studying art, they gave us extra credit if we turned a study in with our finished painting. And I was not alone in this. The whole class, we did it. We would paint the finished painting, and then we would paint the study for the extra credit. So, which is now I think is ridiculous. But so it took a few years to find out that really it is helpful to do the study before you do the finished piece. So I commend that to you. And I'm pretty dark with these first layers of paint. Most of these layers of paint are going to be covered, but you see these sort of washy, light block-ins of the landscape. And I used to try to do the block-in that way, where I was just establishing the different colors and so on. But you have to cover it completely because it's the wrong value. So I try to get the correct value or a little darker with these first films of paint. And the reason is that those little bits of dark paint will show through the finished film of paint when I'm completely done and give much more an illusion. So those little dark pieces give an illusion of detail, or rather than when you have little sort of light pieces of the block-in showing through dark passages, the painting just looks unfinished to me. So I tend to go quite strong with my value in the beginning, and that's why. So one thing I'm looking at here, this, now that I'm painting it, there's an angle that ends in a rock here, and it's the same angle here that ends in a rock. So thinking about repeating patterns, this is pretty similar. Two movements that are really mimicking each other. So it would be better if I arrange the shadows differently. So these darker pieces in here, I want to change them a little bit so that they're more aligned like that rather than a line that's mimicking this one. So I'm going to point that out. The way that I mix color too, the sort of way I was trained, the first influences, the first people who taught me how to paint with oil, I remember one of my teachers, she would only mix, I think, 2 pigments plus white, and then she would scrape it off her palette and throw it away. So very concerned with this pure color. And so I painted that way, and my colors always just felt very strange and disjointed. There wasn't really a harmony. And so I have developed just this way of mixing paint where I have this one puddle that I'm constantly shifting around, up and down in value, warm and cool in temperature, and the only thing that I won't mix out of this is the sky. Typically I can't, because then the sky looks all wrong. But it's helpful in the end for me because I feel like I have a more harmonious look to my color in the end. I had a friend come into my studio, and he looked at my paintings and he said, "Do you ever use yellow? Your paintings are all so dark and gray." And at first I thought, oh no, that's, I'm doing something wrong. And then the more I've painted, I love those more somber tonalist harmonies, and I see them in the landscape. And I think that's also, I'm a New Englander, and it rains. There are a lot of gray days in New England, so I think that's probably part of it. So anyway, that's why I mix paint this way. And if you haven't tried it, you should give it a try. See if you like it. Again, these violets, I saw them from life. They are not contrived. They're just that sky shining down on wet rock in the harbor here, and complemented beautifully by the seaweed. Speaking of seaweed, I need to start getting some of that in. One of my favorite landscape painters is Clyde Assovic, and I was able to visit him. I've been able to visit him a couple of times in his studio in Montana, and we were looking at this. It looked finished to me. I guess it wasn't. But I asked him how long does it take you to paint something this size, and he said, oh, it's, I think, 80% done in 3 or 4 days. And then I just put it on the wall and I live with it and I play with it until it's just right. And it was just really liberating to me to hear that. Is this first, I can be in a hurry, and there's, with oil paint, one of my favorite pieces is it's based on, it's because of Clyde's advice. I spent a whole year picking at it, changing it until it was just right, and it's really, I think, one of my most successful pieces. So I am concerned to be as accurate as possible from the very beginning, but I don't have that pressure of it has to be perfect all the way through. And that has, I think that's something that's a mindset. Because in the beginning I kind of did, you know, you have to, I had the goal that I would place a stroke and leave it, because I thought that's how Sargent painted. And I actually think that's not how he painted, now that I've seen his work in person. But before seeing it in person, you're just looking at it on computer screens or in books, and it looks like he painted it one stroke at a time until it was perfect. But
TJ, let's take a little break for some questions.
okay, question time.
Yeah, you're doing a great job.
Thanks.
Just as a reminder for everyone, the question form is below the video on our website. So go ahead and submit any questions you want. Every 45 minutes, we'll try to take a break and get to those. So the first is from Lise Sadler. It says, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm hoping you will cover more about the compositional aspects of developing the design for a studio piece from plein air sketches.
Okay, so how did I get to this design? Well, so the plein air sketches, I was able to just capture a little square, and there wasn't much design involved. So what I'll do is I'll sit down and I'll look through all of the photographs that I have. And I used to do thumbnails in a sketchbook, and you can still do that. That's a fine way to do it. But recently, I will get in Photoshop and pick I knew I wanted to do this as a sort of a wide rectangle here, and get in Photoshop and start playing around with the composition. So I'll paint in Photoshop, I'll move things around. So it's a really versatile way to find a composition with very, very quickly. And so that's what I'll do with the photographs. And you know, that I basically arrange using the idea of the rule of thirds. So it's not a very, I don't have a very complex process where I have like this really science of, you know, it's not that involved. The rule of thirds. So this, if you take your canvas or on Photoshop, you divide your image into thirds, horizontally and vertically. You want your center of interest and secondary center of interest to be where those lines intersect. So if you think the boats, that's basically where those thirds are going to intersect. And this here is going to be basically where those thirds intersect. I put the horizon line a little bit above the third, and if I were doing a sky piece, I could do that the other way around, have more sky. And then composing the lines. So a lot of times the landscape, I've chosen to paint it because I liked it as it was, so I don't change it that much. But composing these lines so that they are, I like S-curves a lot in landscape painting, just so your eye can get through and go back and forth. So you can see, if you look at this one, I have that already going for me, this S-curve. And I photoshopped this so that it would be, actually I think I photoshopped this rock over a little bit so that it kind of gives you a little bit more scale for the front here. But that's basically how I arrive at composition. So I don't want your eye to, so like, I try not to have a long line. So if you think of this just going all the way, like if this were all water, and this line were going all the way off and there were nothing to stop it, like I try to have if there are strong lines going off the piece, I try to stop them somehow. So that's another composition idea. So.
Great. Another question from Felicity in New Zealand. It's 4 a.m. right now.
Hey.
New Zealand. She says, love your work and would love to hear more about your story as an artist, your training, and how you got to where you are, etc. Also listening to you talk about keeping variety in the scene, even if there is reality, even if in reality there's a lot of sameness. In your opinion, is there ever a time to copy that sameness, or even weird, unexpected shapes in a landscape?
So, if you were painting something that, you know, in order to represent it. So if it's a very, very specific thing, like, I don't know, you know, you're at the Grand Canyon and there are a lot of repeating shapes, or, you know, something where it was really important to the scene to represent that. But I can't think of a time when I've ever seen a painting where there were a lot of repeating shapes and I thought that it was a good thing. I think it's always a good idea to enforce variety in your painting. So even, you know, in painting a farm scene and I have a row of fence posts and they're all basically the same, I'll vary them, just because that variety makes the painting more interesting. It makes if you can be less predictable in your painting, people are going to be more interested looking at it. Just because it's harder to digest mentally. You know, if there are a lot of similar shapes, it's easy to see everything about the piece quickly, and it is therefore less interesting. So, yes, I always vary the shapes, even if you think of a row of trees that are the same species, the same age. If you look at them, they all look the same until you really look at them, and then they look different. So I would just find the things about them that are different and make the most of them. So, and my story as an artist, you know, quickly here, I was homeschooled, and my parents were very, very supportive of my creativity from the beginning. And I saw some literature for a Christian school in Florida that they were doing a more traditional approach to art, and I remember I had no idea that you could still learn to paint like that, because I was looking at state schools closer to me in Vermont, and they were all modern abstract in their professors, and the work that they were doing and the students were doing, it was all modern abstract. So seeing good realism was very, very exciting. So I didn't know that, just because I didn't know the art world, I didn't know that they were doing that sort of thing in New York City too, which is a lot closer to Vermont. But so I went to Florida and studied, and it was a commercial art degree, so it was pretty broad, but I fell in love with oil painting there, and had a show of schoolwork mostly right after graduating, and sold enough to think that it was a viable career. So I jumped in. That's my story in a nutshell.
Excellent, thank you. We'll hold the rest till next break.
Okay, so we'll keep going. So that question about composition. So talking about repeating shapes, arriving at this composition, it's why I've decided that I need to rearrange the shadows down here somehow, is to make this composition more interesting. this little rock right here. Stop. And leave a spot for it, pick up after it. And arriving at a composition that'll work for a finished piece, that is the slower part. So I have a few sort of their Photoshop compositions that I've been looking at I mean, some of them have been in my my current projects folder on my computer for years. And, you know, there'll be something about them that I don't quite like and, you know, needs changing, but I don't know what it is. So that's a much slower part of the process for me. I try to have it when I'm actually executing it, like I am today, that a lot of the work has been done. I think of it like a movie. If you think of the script is already written, the actors are chosen, and they know exactly what they're going to film. Now, there's more play in my process than that, but that's the idea. One thing that has been really helpful for me with composition is just find, you know, assemble photographs of your favorite painter's work and do, you know, copy them in a sketchbook and just look at what they're doing in their composition and try to bring that into your own work. Block in that rock and this one. See the reflection of this rock here. So leave a spot for that. And then the reflection of the pier comes to here. So leave a spot for that. This is the edge here where some of the seaweed is sticking up above the water. And so it's a nice soft edge here. As you get closer to this island, the ocean is darker and it gets lighter as it comes down. So that's the way it is in my studies, so I'm just going to mimic that. And I can paint the boats over that. So something that my teacher, whose name was Brian Jekyll, really the main painting teacher at Pensacola Christian College when I was there studying, told all of us was that whatever you're struggling with in your paintings has been solved by someone else before already. That the problem has already been solved, so go find who that artist is and figure out how they solved the problem. And that has really stuck with me. So the idea that, so there are painters who just paint the ocean perfectly, right? You just love the way they paint the ocean. Take the time to look at their paintings and try to find out, sort of go beyond just admiring their work. Try to find out how they did it. I was with Steve Houston in his studio a little while ago, and he said if you copy one artist, you're plagiarizing. If you copy two, you're schizophrenic. If you copy three, you're original. So sort of take what you like from the painters that you like and really analyze their work and find ways to bring that into your own process. So, and I still do that. I have thousands of pictures on my computer that I'll, when I'm getting ready to do a painting, it's sort of like the research phase. I'll cycle through and sort of try to understand how they made certain aspects of their painting work, and I think that shows up in my own pieces. The thing to look out for is if you start looking like you're, so you can look at your work, someone could look at your work and tell who your favorite artist is. So that's why I think it's important to look at a pretty broad selection and try to find the pieces of whatever their work is that you find inspiring. There's a boat right back here. I'm just gonna sort of thinly paint, and I'll paint that boat back in when I get over there. I am trying to just block in the big shapes right now. And I am thinking of them as flat shapes of color for the most part. I'm not thinking of them as anything other than a piece of my paint by number. Just put enough colors in the right shape, in the right place, and it starts to look like something. That's kind of the stage right now. Sort of magic starts to emerge. This is the reflection. A little dark. A little better there. It's about the same value as the water surrounding it. So that's important. So for those of you who are watching who've maybe taken a plein air workshop with me before, you can see that the process right now is pretty much exactly the same. So it's when I get into finishing the work and how I layer and add texture that my studio work really sort of becomes unique from my field work. But and so again, right now so this reflection should line up with this. It's the shadow. The landscape behind. A lot of these, sort of, if you will, more painterly strokes are going to be modified and covered up, but for now they're great because they'll show through a little bit, they'll add a little bit of variety. So when I was a student, I loved, Morgan Weisling has this 10-hour demonstration, and I watched it twice. So, and I didn't fall asleep once, so that's dedication, I think, 20 hours of Morgan Weisling painting. But something he said, which really changed the way that I approached painting, was sometimes I make a mistake on purpose because it's more interesting, or sometimes I leave a mistake, that's what he said. Sometimes I leave a mistake because it makes the painting more interesting when I correct it. So it's an interesting idea for just getting variety into your piece. So this is a stage in the painting where I'm not freaking out that maybe this shape isn't just right, because I have plenty of time over the next 3 days to adjust that shape. And I certainly will adjust almost everything in this, but these first sort of expressive pieces of the painting. Now, the thing about these shapes is they're not going in the wrong place, and for the most part, they're not the wrong value. Those are two things that I'm pretty precise about. So if I paint this rock over here or over here, then as I build up texture, it's not going to be helpful to me if it's in the wrong place. So I'm putting them in the right place. But as far as making these little strokes and so on, this is a pretty forgiving passage, or pretty forgiving stage, the painting here. Looking up at my plein air, there's some sort of gray-violet dark in here. And this is, of course, where the tide comes up to here. And so it's different color below that line. And so the challenge is to represent that as the lighter part of the rock is in the light, and the darker part of the rock is in the light, and then there's shadow as well. So just to make sure that in the end that this rock doesn't look like it's half in shadow or something like that. This is in light. I haven't said this yet, the light is warm. So we're going to have warm light, cool shadows. These golden afternoons, that's what you have. Beautiful blue shadows. I'm just going to leave, and it works for now, just leave that tone right there and just move on and paint the shadows back here. This rock, which has shadows being cast on it. And there's a shrub here, and the rock is in the light a little bit there, so I'm just going to leave those two spots. And especially in my plein airs, there are these beautiful greens in the reflection of the wharf that I saw. And so I can go a little bit overboard with that green just to make sure. And I don't even know if it actually will be. I think this might be pretty accurate, but maybe it will. So this is the initial reflection of the pier up here above. And I step back and look a lot, but I'm really happy with what's starting to happen here. This is going well. I think starting a painting, particularly a studio piece, it's always so exciting because it's like this time, this painting is going to be amazing. And it doesn't matter. Whatever happened yesterday, this new painting is going to be the best piece I've ever created. So I think of, those dogs that chase trucks. They, every time they chase a truck, they chase the truck as if they're going to be able to catch it. I'm that way with every new painting started. It just that enthusiasm doesn't go away, and I feed it too, So there's some places in the middle of the painting sometimes that get a little bit tedious and difficult, and we'll get through those in the next couple of days together. But for now, this is an exciting start. It's almost all potential at this point. Just shooting for that rock in, so this is the part that's not affected, the tide, so it's not that, it's the lighter part above where the tide comes, the high tide comes. Just get that painted in. Use those colors over there. And you can see drawing in with both toning the panel with transparent earth yellow, could have done it with transparent earth red as well, but then drawing or sketching out the composition with my transparent earth red, you have these little pieces where that warmth is shining through. Most of those in the end will be covered, but it's a really beautiful effect for a scene like this, because we have that nice warm light on my subject. Okay, so now it's time to block in the more distant things. I'm also getting a lot of false highlights, which are just where you put in paint, and if it's a vertical or if it's a horizontal stroke, the light from above, you get glare on those. sort of brush track marks catch the light and you get false highlights. And that actually, when you're painting water, is not always a bad thing because water does that, right? And so having some glare on passages or parts of your paintings that are of water can be really helpful in trying to get the effect of water. But in shadows on rocks, not a good thing. So I'm just taking a big swath. This is a rosemary brush. It's nice and soft, and it's great for taking out those track marks. I tend to use stiffer bristle brushes. I just learned to paint with them. They're Robert Simmons Signet brushes, and I love them. And let me see. Getting ready to paint that island that's just across the harbor here. This is Stonington, Maine, by the way, which is just, I think it's one of the most magical little towns on earth. And I went for the first time last summer. So it's interesting, the story about Stonington. There's a gallery near Nashville called Haynes Gallery. It's owned by Gary Haynes. And I was there and I saw these beautiful paintings. Just, you know, you could just feel the landscape. It was just, they were wonderful. Of houses, these old houses in Gary Haynes Gallery. And they were by Peter Poskus. So you can look him up. He's great. And so I loved those. I loved those paintings, studied them, and sort of in my memory bank, you know, I think of them while I'm painting. And so last summer, that was years ago, and last summer went to Maine and discovered the town of Stonington, and just loved it there. And of course, these sources are from Stonington. And I was talking to Gary on the phone a few weeks ago, and he mentioned that Peter Poskus has painted in Stonington a lot. And I looked up on Google and found that those paintings that I found so inspiring were paintings of Stonington. So it's a funny thing. The landscape moved me in his paintings, and then I went there and I had no idea that, you know, that I had seen paintings of this place before. But it's the same sort of, so he's able to really capture the feeling of the place. So I can't remember where I was going with that, but just blocking in this distant piece of land back here. So, atmospheric perspective is an important part of the landscape painter's craft. I think if you think of a portrait, a lot of the time the depth in the portrait from the tip of the subject's nose to the wall behind them, maybe 6 feet of depth, maybe a little bit more. If it's in a room or a large room, more than that, but typically not that much. Still life, you know, 2 feet, a foot, something like that. Landscape painting, you're trying to represent miles of depth, and atmospheric perspective is the tool that you use, one of the tools, the best tools that you use to do that. And it is just that between between the viewer and the distant things, there's more atmosphere, there's more air, and that makes whatever's back there lighter and cooler. So you're not going to have dark darks and strong colors in the distance. It's going to be cooler, it's going to be lighter, and that's a way to represent, in a nutshell, that's a very basic understanding of atmospheric perspective. So these are pine trees in the sunlight, but because they're distant, they're that gray, cool color. And I have that's the sort of thing that's, knowing that is helpful. You can also see it in the landscape when you paint it. It's even in that song, right? Purple, the patriotic song, Purple Mountain Majesty. People know that distant mountains are blue and purple. So you can see it, but it's good to know why. And that's kind of, in my process, sort of like the study of anatomy. Knowing about your subject is important, and so you're able to catch yourself when you're looking at it and help yourself see what's really there. Okay, so just going to finish this island off. It's too dark. And I need to show that it's low tide over there as well. And I don't have that really in, because I actually didn't paint my sketches at low tide. The tide was going out as I was painting, and my wife and children were with me, and we had to eat dinner. I have 3 children under the age of, well, the oldest is 5. So we had to eat dinner, and so I was able to sneak away from dinner and get a few photographs of low tide, but my sketches were a little bit before low tide. So all of that to say, it has to be low tide over on this island as well. So just a bit of a dark line across the bottom just to show that the same thing is happening over here, there as is happening here. Make it consistent. Okay. And now this more distant island back here. And it is bluer yet. A little too dark, my mixture here. It's a little too warm. Cool it down a little bit. That's gonna work. So here we go. Distant island. a little bit darker. And just removing those false highlights. I do that throughout. So what will happen is painting will dry and I won't be able to do that anymore. So then you can sand them out or scrape them out, but just my process to do it this way. Okay, now the sky. Now, I always clear a spot on my palette off. This is where I'll make sure the palette's clean and I can just get a completely new mixture without any of the browns and grays, because they'll make the sky look dirty in my experience. So I also am cleaning my brush throughout in mineral spirits here. So I don't switch brushes very often, but I do clean my brush. Now the sky, there was sort of a haze down near the horizon line that cleared as you went up. So you have these nice blues of a clear sky above, but within the picture plane, we have that gray, sort of mysterious color, which I just loved. And I'm going to try to get that gray by mixing Viridian. So this is Viridian and white. And then just add a touch of my Naphthol Scarlet, or, you know, it's sort of it's a stand-in for cadmium red. And get something like that gray. It's a little too dark. Lighten it up. It's a little too cool. Warm it up. And just sort of overlap the sky a little bit on the mountain, or the island back here. Let's just soften that edge. So a little bit of impressionism up here, just varying the color ever so slightly. Okay, and now I'm going to get this green here and this green here, and then I'm going to call the first, well actually really the second stage of the painting is done. There are only 111 stages to go and we'll be done. I just made that number up, I don't know how much we have, but so this is a closer green, right? So there's less air between the viewer and these greens, so they're a little bit warmer, they're more chromatic. You can see how just that shift, that starts to come toward us. That is just the sort of thing that you want to happen. And then on this side as well, there's a bush over here. And again, closer to us, stronger shadows. There won't be shadows like this anywhere on that island over there. And then this is so distant you can't even tell the difference between light and shadow. Okay, so there's the block in. Everything is basically where it's going to go. The colors are all, and they're headed in the right direction. So now it's just going to be, I can continue to work over the whole painting, or I can pick, because I have enough of a reference, I have enough relationships, I can also find one place and render that out. So really whatever works. I think of painting a landscape. So I'm always looking for the easiest thing to do next. I'm looking for the path of least resistance. So the more things that I can get accurate, then it makes it possible to achieve the more difficult things, the more difficult passages, because you have more reference, you have more things that can guide you. So I don't have the mindset with my work that I need to find the most difficult part and go for that. I try to start with the easy things, the easiest shapes to see and understand, the easiest colors to see and understand.
All right, we're going to take a couple more questions. It's not quite at the 45-minute mark, but
Good
it's
place to break.
11:30.
Okay.
So we have a question from somebody from Stowe, Vermont, asking if you ever come back to the area for workshops.
Stowe?
Uh-huh.
I do, yeah. I usually do a workshop somewhere in Vermont every summer.
Where can they find that information?
What's that?
Where can they find updated information?
So my website is the place to check as soon as I have a workshop scheduled. There's a workshops tab on my website, so just check back, join my mailing list, and I email people about that too. So,
do you ever have do you ever do a completed, finished painting entirely on location?
Sure, yeah. So I used to have that as my goal, and so the largest strictly plein air painting I've ever painted, I think it's the largest, was 4 feet wide by 2 feet. So I kept going back to the same, every sunny morning I went back to the same place and painted. And the piece was successful and I enjoyed doing it, but over the years I just like the pace in the studio more, and the sort of textures and effects that that are just easier to achieve in the studio. So layers and glazes and different tools that aren't, when you're working from life. I guess if you had enough time you could do that, but I wasn't really satisfied with the look of those larger pieces that I was doing, and I was starting and finishing from life. And so, and part of that is my favorite landscape painters, none of them finish work from life, as far as I know. They work in the studio. So, and again, that's just investigating, you know, work that you enjoy. So if you love Aljo Hibbard's work, I think that he worked mostly in the field. So if you love his work, then you probably want to work mostly in the field. If you love George Carlson's work, I know he gets color studies from life, but his work, I think he works on maybe 2 or 3 paintings a year, and they're all in the studio, and he works on them for the whole year. So, and I love his work. So that's how I've arrived at that. But good question.
Can you describe your normal studio setup? Is your palette bigger, or are there any differences in your setup at home?
Yeah, so I have a wooden easel and a tabaret in front of that, and then I have a wooden palette that I just set. I can hold it, but I don't usually. I just set it on the tabaret in front of my easel, and so it's very similar to this setup. It's really not very different. I have a chair. Sometimes I sit, sometimes I stand. It depends, but yeah, that's and I have my sources on either side, so it's really just like this setup.
How about lighting?
Lighting. Okay, so I have a north light window that's really nice light during the day, and then I have 10 cans in my studio ceiling on a dimmer. So if they're all the way up there, it's very, very, very bright in there. But what I'll try to do when I go into work in the morning is they're on a dimmer switch, so I try to have them as low as possible so that they're just ever so slightly augmenting the light that's coming through my north light. But I find that a lot of my collectors, they'll buy a piece and they'll put it in their hallway or in a living room, and they're depending on, you know, window light. They're not, for some reason, you know, they spend, well, I should say, let me be careful how I phrase this. Typically, when I see my work in my collectors' homes, it's not that well lit. They sort of just go where there's already a light somewhere in the house that gives it enough light. So I have developed the process where I'm painting this painting for a dark room. So I try to work in as low light as possible, because the painting will more than likely live in low light for the rest of its life. And if you take a painting that's been painted in low light and you put really good light on it, it doesn't do it any harm. So it's nice whether it's in a bright light or in a low light. That's how I think of it. So the lighting in my studio, I can make it really bright in there, but for the most part, I'm trying to keep it as dim as possible. So.
Question. Do you use a more limited palette when you do plein air work?
Sometimes. When I first started painting the landscape, I used cadmium lemon, cadmium red, and ultramarine blue. And for about a year, that's all I used. And then I just started adding colors back onto it. And that was for studio work as well. And a limited palette is a really great way to understand, a really great way to come to understand your colors. And it's a great exercise, but I just enjoy the range that I can get by adding more color. So no, this is my palette. I use it in the field. I use it to paint head studies. We painted a head study last night. I use these exact colors, and really for anything. So I change my palette around quite a bit. I'm not, I just enjoy trying new colors. But I don't have like a palette that's for the studio, or a palette for plein air, a palette for portrait. It's all the same palette. So while I'm using that palette, I'm using that palette. And then if I change it, it's changed for everything. So.
Did you talk about your brushes yet?
I haven't, no. My brushes are, for the most part, they're just Robert Simmons Signet brushes. I have right here, okay, so you can see them. They're flats and filberts. I don't like brights because they sort of scrub the paint off while you're putting it on. And variety of sizes. I use some synthetic brushes and some smaller synthetic brushes for details. I sort of went through a stage where I was buying, oh, and I also use some rosemary brushes, the big soft rosemary brushes, and you've already seen me use it this morning to get rid of the false highlights. I painted with them a lot last night with the head study that we did. Is trying to get that softness with a big soft brush, but I don't usually use them to actually paint very much. Just clean this off, sorry. But anyway, I went through a stage where I was using really cheap brushes. So you can, I was using, like, I would go to Walmart and buy a huge pack of synthetic brushes with short handles and paint with those. And the reason, because I was using synthetic brushes more at that stage, and I could destroy them and then throw them away and not feel badly about it. So, but I've kind of gotten out of that. So I just sort of, I really like Robert Simmons bristle brushes, natural bristle brushes. That's my brush of choice.
A couple more questions, then I'll let you get back to painting. I like when people are engaged in the live stream. So
sure, yeah.
Nancy Custer Carroll from Vermont. You may know her or not.
Yes, I recognize that name. Hi, Nancy.
So TJ, it's a delight to see you painting again. In last night's conversation, it was mentioned that accuracy is so important in head study painting, and there's more freedom in landscape painting. Would you agree that accuracy is in painting the lines of boats, the line shapes, etc. of boats may be all important?
Yes, certainly. Yeah. So there are certain things in the landscape that you just cannot get wrong. So think of the perspective in general, but if you're painting architecture and you know the perspective is wrong, you mentioned boats, vehicles, anything like that where the viewer could look at your painting and go, ooh, that doesn't look right. So but when you're painting a face, because human beings, like we grow up staring at our mother's faces. We grow up staring at faces and trying to understand and read them. And so I could make, say, this island, I'm not that concerned about, maybe it's a little bit taller than it should be, or maybe it should be a little bit shorter from life to match exactly the island behind that. But if I were to do that with somebody's hairline or where someone's nose falls, like that completely changes likeness. And so that's what I meant yesterday by like that accuracy. Really, you can't put the mouth off to the side a little bit and still have a portrait. It starts to look really foolish quickly. And so it would be the same, but it's even more precise than with a boat, because there isn't just one type of boat that every single person recognizes. Unlike faces, where we all have very similar faces. They all follow the same basic structure, and people can tell immediately. So accuracy, but not to the same degree as in portraiture. I hope that answers the question.
Excellent, thanks. There are a few more, but I'll keep them for the next round. So.
Okay, all right. So this is and I've already talked to you about, you get the painting to a certain stage, and at least for me, and I know that some of my students have this too, you get it to a certain stage and there's just sort of this feeling like, okay, now what? Now what do I do? What do I do next? It's sort of, one level complete, and you're trying to find the passageway to the next level. of the painting. So, you know, if you're in the studio and you're not under a lot of pressure in time, you can take this opportunity to, you know, look through an art book, walk around, check Instagram, you know, whatever. And then come back with fresh eyes and think through what you need to do next. I'm not going to do that because we're on the clock here, but just to give you a sense of this sort of more, there's more time, and you can take the time to be creative. But anyway, what do I do next? And I don't actually have an answer to that question. So I'm looking at the painting, step back, look at it. Because I have all the colors blocked in, I can just pick a spot and work on it. So I'm going to save the boats for tomorrow. That's going to be tomorrow's task. Just so you know, if that's what stands out to you in your own paintings work, I'm going to get into that tomorrow. I think for now, I'm just going to dig into this rock. It's a great sort of place to start from, and we'll see where I go from there. I pick a smaller brush, and the first thing, just to sort of re-examine the drawing there, which I've lost a little bit right here. And there was this nice green sort of cast to these shadows in my plein air. So I want to be careful I don't lose. Again, while you're working in the studio, if there's a disagreement between any of your other sources and your plein air on what the color or value should be, try to teach yourself to trust your plein air, unless you know, and I just got that wrong. But they are really, really valuable. So happier with that drawing. Sort of as the rock rounds, you know, you have thinking of it as a three-dimensional object. It faces up toward the sky, the top of it does, so it's reflecting more of those blues, which is an important thing. Something that one of my favorite painters, who's a plein air painter, Carl Rungus, said is that if you paint in the studio all the time, your paintings start to get too hot, which is a really, and you can kind of see that in the work of illustrators and different artists like that who spend most of their time indoors painting. You tend to get much warmer color harmonies. And I'm not sure exactly why that is, but I know that going outside and painting from life has helped me to see those blues, like that one that I just put in there. You can see just, well, there's a lot of glare. Maybe you can't see. Let me soften that a little bit. Oops. Start to have that three-dimensional look right away with that blue sky being reflected down. And this is where building up a little bit of texture as this rock is coming toward us is actually really great. So again, just gives that sort of three-dimensional look. Adjust this drawing ever so slightly. So really with my studio work, because there was a question a little while ago, do you ever finish your paintings from life? And I want them to look like they were finished from life, but I also want to have that time with them to give them the textures that you don't really get in one layer. And now, of course, you could do multiple layers from life, but a lot of the time, when I'm painting somewhere, I'm not painting something right now anyway that I can easily get back to. And also, I don't like selling my plein air paintings because I like having them around as reference for other studio pieces. So that's part of it too. If I finish my plein air and sell it, then that's a lot of reference that I've lost. So. Sort of looking at my sketches, there's a little bit more of a blue color. Right on the edge here. There's another part of the rock that's facing up toward the sky. It's a little bit cooler. And that begins to get that sculpted look. Get a little bit more of that down here as well. It starts to come down, starts to face up toward the sky a little bit more. A little bit softer. One place that you can find strong colors and even invent them is where the light changes to shadow, so in the midtones. So I'm just going to invent this really warm color where the rock is rolling around into the shadow. I think that'll help add interest. So anything is fair game in a studio, in one of my studio landscapes. In a recent painting I was working on, for me they're very recognizable range of mountains. And there was a mountain that just was screwing up my composition, so I took it out. And the piece was stronger, and someone who was not a local, so I don't know if a local would have liked it, but someone who didn't know those mountains purchased it. So I think of it like that, I really, anything's up for grabs. This has to stand alone in the studio. So again, from life, this is a distinct, it's a difference. Working from life, I'm just trying to capture the scene as quickly and as accurately as I can because the light's changing and so on. But in the studio, I'm trying to make it the best piece of art that I possibly can. If you think of there are some exceptions to this, but if I go into a museum and I look at landscape painting, I don't even know where these paintings were painted, and I don't care. You know, it's the fact, it's what they are as art that captivates me. So as you go through a studio piece, and even working on this one, you know, if you're working on it with me, there's something about the composition or the scene that bothers you, change it. And that's something that I'm beginning to tell myself, I'm beginning to stop myself and say when I'm like, oh, I need to copy the photograph, or I need to copy the source, whatever. I'm beginning to train myself to think that if all you're doing is copying the photograph, if all you're doing is copying your source, that's a bad reason. You need to come up with a better reason than that to do what you're doing. So I commend that to you. We're representational artists, you know. We love the way things really look. So it's a little counterintuitive to change things, but it's good to be able. And this advice that I'm sharing with you, it comes from a decade of painting myself as a professional. I painted before that as a student, but as a professional, I painted for a decade. And also that comes from listening carefully to painters that I admire, to reading this is the wisdom that I've been able to gather. And I always think in an opportunity like this live stream, whether you're watching me live or you're watching it later, or years from now, it'll be available, that my goal, whenever I'm talking to students, is to try and shorten your journey just a little bit. If I can share some of my aha moments with you, and maybe it'll take you 5 years to get where I have in 10. You know, that's my goal as a teacher, that I can point out parts of my process that will speed up your journey. So make sure you keep those questions coming in, because they help me gauge what I need to talk to you about.
TJ, I have a question, if I may.
By all means.
As you're painting that rock and developing it a little bit more, which study are you referring to most? The one on the left, or that nice little one up on the top right of my screen?
So this, really, I'm probably a little bit more this one, just because I have, that one's a little bit more worked out, but I am looking at these two a lot. And this is the color, because it's later in the day here. That's the color that I'm more interested in. So a little bit more this one, but both. And if you want, feel free to, questions that are coming in, I'd be happy to answer them as I'm painting too. But I can see there's a nice reddish warmth that I have in my sketch that I like, so I'm just going to reintroduce it. But I did like that blue up there as well, so let me see if I can get that in there too. And we'll do both. And that makes it a little more interesting. And another thing, with these nice reds down low that I don't quite have yet. And just put them in. There's in the photograph, there's a rail that comes down, and I'm sure that's for sliding boats in and out of here and launching them. I'm not going to include that. It's one thing, and it may be just because I'm not from the coast, but it doesn't really make sense to me. I look at it and I don't really know what it is, so I'm leaving it out. So now with that much established, I'm looking at that pier here, and it just looks too dark to me. Stepping back, looking at it, comparing the study that I have with that, and I think it's just a little bit too dark, so I'm going to lighten it. Make it make sense. Not a lot, just a little. And I can see in this study that it's sort of a transition from blue to violet. And when I get into the actual finishing, I may reference photographs more. But for me right now, it's enough to just look at my sketch and my plenaires to get the color harmonies and relationships and value correct before I think of any detail. And that's really the thing. I'm slowly working to detail. There's something in oil painting, and it's always the same in my process, that I try to work large to small. So you get and you saw me do that, right? You watched me do that. I had the big shapes in, and now I can work on smaller shapes. So large, accurate shapes are a guarantee almost of large or accurate small shapes. But accurate small shapes don't guarantee necessarily. It's much harder to judge the rest of the painting by little tiny shapes. So I stick with the large shapes first, and work with the large shapes, and then to the medium shapes, and then from there to the small shapes and tiny shapes if need be. I think I'm going to lighten that and put a little more color in there yet. I like that much better as the preliminary layer. I think that makes more sense to me. And I just need to get the glare out. And when I go over it with this soft brush, it also softens everything, gets the glare out. And something that you need to be careful to remember, you have a photograph which necessarily renders edges all wrong. I mean, I never like the edges as they're presented in a photograph. It makes everything too hard. But it's also a temptation to just, because you have the time to sort of really delineate every single thing in your landscape. So you just need to remember in the studio that nature is soft. It's just soft. There aren't that many hard edges, and even if you think there are, if you really squint and analyze, there aren't that many. So anyway, you just need to keep my edges soft. I don't want to end up with a really hard-edged painting, because that's another, depending on how you do it. I mean, if that's your style or you want it to be, I think painters like Maynard Dixon, he used a lot of outlines and sharp edges, and that was just his approach, and it works. But if you're just sort of absent-mindedly making everything sharp, you're not going to end up with a very satisfying painting. So I need to take a step back and look and think. I am going to keep working on this part of the painting, but I'd like to jump down and start working on this shore a little bit. And I brought some of the tools. Let me go grab them. I brought some of the tools that I use in my studio with me, including this It's I think it's for drywall. I think it's a drywall knife. And it murdered a tube of yellow paint in my suitcase on the way here. But anyway, so use that. And then I have just a couple of sets of, if I can get a couple out of the bag, a couple of sets together of sculpting tools that I have from previous attempts to sculpt. So these are great for starting to get a variety of textures into my, my painting. And so I'm not going to start using them quite yet, but I'm almost ready to. But that's the sort of buildup of texture that I want to try and get into each of my studio pieces that, again, if you're sketching from life, there just isn't time, or I don't have time. But I think it's time to go a little bit thicker. So everything's pretty thin right now, and I'm eager to start getting a little bit more buildup of paint here, even on this first layer. So I'm mixing remixing some of these colors. And this is something that I first saw it and understood it in some of John Singer Sargent's landscapes when I was able to see them in person. If you have thin paint for the distant objects and thick paint for the near objects, that really helps the illusion of depth. So just a sturdier, thicker film of paint up close, something that you could just walk right out onto, right? And that's the kind of the goal with landscape painting. Like, I'm trying to give the viewer something that they could step out onto, into the piece, into the scene. And so trying to use thick paint on this lower edge really is just, it's the first edge your eye finds, or that's the first place you would walk if you were to walk into the piece. It's been pretty rewarding. That's a successful approach. That edge is going to stay pretty firm because you're seeing it. This is an object that's overlapping. So this part of because it's all covered with water when the tide is high, but so this part of it's now shore, it's the bottom of the harbor when the tide is in, but this part is higher, so it's sort of rolling over and overlapping the water behind. So that's going to give us a firmer edge. Wherever you have something overlapping something else, you'll have a firmer edge than where you have light actually turning to shadow. That'll be a softer edge. So the edge there being crisp, at least somewhat, makes sense and helps make sense of the topography that I'm working with here. And you can see also I'm thinning my paint ever so slightly as I work back to there. Again, that idea of thicker paint in front. And I'm going to go even thicker. Now, this is only day one, so there's time for more buildup. But even just that, I don't know how well that shows on the screen, but this in person here feels so much closer than this. And it's really just it's a texture thing. It's not anything other than that. So one thing to do in the studio, one thing that I have enjoyed doing, and I haven't been this strict in a while, but for a season I would set a timer, and every 15 minutes I would change my tool. So from a synthetic brush to a bristle brush, from a bristle brush to a palette knife, and so on, just to try and get as much variety into my painting as I could by changing tools. So I do that more instinctively now, and but that's a good exercise. Just set a timer and change your tool every 15 minutes and try to, don't switch passages, stick with the same thing so you're rendering the same thing but with a different tool. And so there are painters who, they sort of, and painters that I like, this is not, I'm not criticizing this as if it were a bad thing, but they sort of have the same brush stroke for every part of their painting. So they paint the sky, the river, the mountains, and the trees all with the same brush stroke, and effectively and beautifully. But I just find that I love varying my brushwork. And I think it's a little bit more mysterious, which I think is one of the goals. That's one of my goals, is to be a little bit more mysterious with, so you can't always tell exactly how it was painted. Now, you're all watching me paint this, so you can tell exactly how this is painted, but the viewer may not be able to. So something, even just, I do this a lot, where you take a paper towel and you just rub it over wet paint and rip it off, and then maybe just move it over a little bit so there's a lot of paint still on there. And that just creates an interesting, and of course you have to modify it, but it creates an interesting texture that it isn't really super clear to someone looking at the painting where that texture came from, or how. It's not an obvious thing. So if that makes sense. In my pursuit of texture, I'm always trying to find ways to vary. So the sculpting tools that have teeth can be really fun. Just so they leave a few of those marks, and again, these they get varied enough so you can't tell exactly what did them. So anyway,
another
another thing.
A question for you.
Yeah.
How much of your time do you spend on plein air compared to studio?
So that varies. So and that varies from year to year, right? So a few years ago, I probably spent half my time plein air painting, and this year, I don't know, but much, much less. And that just because I have so many studio pieces. I sort of have this backlog of studio pieces that I want to create. And so I've just spent a lot more time in the studio working to create those. But if the question if the question was aimed at advice, I would say, especially if you're a beginner, spend as much time painting from life as you can. I did learn a lot in college. My teachers were great, but my best teacher has been the landscape. And that's not just a poetic thing to say, and it's really true. Painting from life, particularly painting the landscape from life, has taught me almost everything I know. Or maybe they were all the things that my teachers tried to teach me and I didn't understand. But paint from life as much as you can, especially in the beginning. Just getting in some of these shadows, and you get the direction of the light. I left them out in the first pass. They're important, so circling back to get them.
TJ, could you just move slightly to your right a little bit? Just while you're painting, because your shoulders.
Oh, okay, the shoulder. So if I don't want anybody to see what I'm doing, the real painting tricks. Okay, so I'm just putting in the shadows that I left out in the block in, and looking for these colors here. So they're not, I do keep pretty gray. I don't like the idea of pushing a color too much. I love, I guess, naturalism. So. Sure.
When working in the studio, what role does narrative play in your work? Do you attempt to add elements, or do you stick mostly to what you see?
Okay, so narrative, I'm not really sure that, so I think that maybe if am I trying to invent a story in the scene? So do I have like two people, do I add two people talking to each other, or, something like that? Sometimes, not often. Most of the time, because I painted it from life, or I didn't paint it from life, I painted the studies from life, there's some sort of emotional connection with that place. And I'm trying to rediscover that. So it's more painting what I see, it's more painting what I remember, but it's, sometimes, and I think most of the time, just copying your source is not going to recapture that feel of the landscape. So I do change and invent. I think that's the answer to the question.
Another question on lighting. If you're painting for and under low light, how do you reconcile that with the plein air sketches painted outside in daylight? What changes?
So I'm referencing the plein air sketches in the same low light. So that I don't run into any issues with having painted it in different light. But typically, plein air paintings, you know, I don't paint them in, so I try to paint from a shadow looking into the light a lot of the time when I'm painting plein air, so they're not really painted in high light either, and end up being nice and bright most of the time, even in low light. So all right, so I'm starting to just build up the textures across the bottom of this painting here, covering up most of the undertone. And keep looking back and seeing, like, there are these strong oranges and yellows for where the dried out seaweed is. And it's important to see like that. So I want to make sure that I don't lose them. I think I did a little bit here, like that's a little too gray if I compare it to what I painted from life. So you need to be careful not to sort of regurgitate those grays onto this finished piece, because I want this piece to have, I certainly don't want it to be less colorful than plein air, right? So I don't really like, well, sometimes pushing colors a little bit, but for the most part, those sort of, you know what I mean, those really loud paintings where they're not very nuanced, they're just really sort of tube color. I don't like that at all. I do like a more mysterious sort of color harmony, at least more mysterious than that, but I don't want, like, if there are these beautiful oranges in my plein air, I don't want to leave them out. So that's kind of my thought process there. This is the seaweed in shadow here on this rock. And the source for that is really right here, what that looks like. Okay, so I'm getting a lot of that, that sort of glare that I don't want to have. And I'm also out of white. I am not conservative with my paint at all while I'm painting. Like, I don't even think about how much paint I'm using. Just, you can't. Remember when I first, when I graduated from college, I used some of my, well, actually a lot of my graduation money to buy a big, huge roll of Clausen's linen, which is a high quality brand of linen. And the first few paintings I painted on it were awful because I was so uptight because of how much the linen cost. And so that was sort of the, you really can't think about that. So I always have students who squeeze their paint onto their palette in these little tiny dot, 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 dot. And I encourage people to paint with real brush strokes with real paint. Just little tiny films. So anyway, paint like a rich man is the advice, or a rich woman. So I use a lot of paint, and you can scrape it off and throw it away. If it's not going well, don't even think about it. The most important thing is the finished product, right? And all of my resources are toward that right now. So I'm just seeing some nice blues in both in my plein airs and in my studio sketch here that I'm not quite, yeah, that's nice. So I'm not going to completely cover over everything. Just, I do use black, which, depending on what school of painting you come from, is either a very acceptable thing to do or a very unacceptable thing to do. That a lot of plein air painters are pretty sure that black would be a terrible thing to add to their palette. And I just love the way that I can use black to gray down a blue. So I use it in my blues quite a bit, just to take ultramarine, cobalt, and make them a little less chromatic and a little bit more realistic. Okay. Just start working on getting this to feel like it's coming in front of, so this piece overlaps this piece. Make sure that's clear. You don't get confused. And that is one thing about painting landscapes, is that if you're looking at something from life, it makes sense, right? If you look at something in a photograph, you believe, just sort of accept the photograph captured it. If you look, you could then do the same thing in paint, and people would just think you painted it wrong. So I'm making a bigger deal about this contrast than I have in the study, and I think there is in the photograph, because I just want it to make sense to the viewer. And I think that helps. Yes, it does. And this is going to be a lot of fun tomorrow when it's set up more. That I can work over it more. But that was good, what I just did. Yeah, this could be a little bit lighter too. Or not lighter, more texture, sorry. This is sort of a big glob of seaweed. That's, don't really like that. So I'm going to alter it. That's a lot better. That looks a lot more like seaweed. Sort of capture the wet sand and rock behind it with these blues. I do love to look at good abstract paintings, because good abstract paintings tend to have really great texture. So in my pursuit of better texture, I like to look at texture and design in abstract paintings. It's a good place to learn. So this is, I'm just going to do it. I want this rock to stand out as close to us and also as a rock, not more seaweed. So I want thick paint there. And I can't put it in my suitcase like this, so I'm going to have to try to convince the folks here at East Oaks to let me leave it with them for a little while. But we'll see if this works. Sometimes this works. And the idea here, and again, this is the sort of risky, time-consuming thing that's great to do in the studio and why I love painting in the studio. But starting with so much of the white actually on the canvas means that most of my mixing is actually happening on the canvas. So when you mix all of your paints, even when you're painting thickly on your palette, you leave most of your paint behind on the palette. So by mixing more by actually mixing the paint on the canvas, theoretically, more of the paint makes it onto the canvas. So I really like that, and we'll see if it survives. That's the thing about painting. It's sort of a catch and release all the way through. You do something that you really like, and then a few hours later you discover that it has to be moved or reduced or whatever, but can't know the future. So for now I really like it. I'll try to make it work, but sort of have a loose hand on a lot of these things, so if I can keep it, I will, but the finished piece is what really matters and what makes the finished piece successful. It's kind of hard to tell in the first few hours. It's a journey, sort of looking up at the mountain, and it's not totally clear. You can tell where the path begins because it's beginning in front of you, but looking ahead of you, you can't tell exactly what the path is going to look like and how it will take you to the top. So just have to... That's really how I think of painting. There are a lot of people, or I've heard a lot of painters say you have to know where everything is going from the very beginning. So that's one approach and works well for some, but I got to spend some time with Clyde Asevig, who's one of my heroes in landscape painting, And he said exactly the opposite, that he sort of changes and changes and changes until he likes it. He explores. That's the verb he used. He's exploring with paint when he paints. So I like that idea of an exploration a lot. So I have a rough idea of where I'm going, and however much time I need to get there.
EJ, I have a question from Lee Sadler about, can you go more in depth on the color information and just composition, that kind of thing? Does that make sense?
So more in depth on color information.
Yeah, using the studies, how to work up the larger, like, so there's so many different studies to the right.
Sure. So the primary plein air sketches that I have this one and this one. And because I paint several plein air paintings on the same panel, it looks pretty busy. But these are just here because I didn't cut them off, and they're also of Maine, so they're helpful in that sense. But I'm looking at this one, and I'm looking at this one, and those were painted entirely from life. And so the color there I trust more than the color in a photograph. This was painted using both the photograph and these color studies. And so some of the colors they're not quite on point. It was something just to work out more the composition. So if there's a debate, just to use it as an example, if there's a disagreement between these violets and these violets, right? I'm going to go with these violets because those are the violets that I saw from life. So that's how I'm processing the color information. For the most part, this is accurate, but wherever that study and this sketch from life differ, I'm trying to go with this sketch from life. So that's how I'm doing the color. And as far as composition, so just to go over again, I see this sort of this S-curve through the shore here. I rearranged this dark shape so that it wouldn't parallel. So in a composition, it's just I'm trying to keep your eye on the canvas. I'm trying to move your eye around the canvas. So I'm avoiding, even here, this line doesn't go all the way across, and then there'll be, when I get to them, there'll be these posts that join this land with that land, sort of catch your eye as it goes across and bring you down. So I don't know what more to say about the composition. This is basically what the scene looked like, and typically that's what I do with landscape painting. I find a scene that I like, and I'm trying to recapture that scene in my studio work. So it's not like I'm starting from zero and totally inventing a composition. This is slightly adjusted from reality. And the things that I adjusted were, I moved this rock in because I needed something to balance out all of the interest and sort of busyness over here. So this rock Just sort of keep your eye from sort of drifting off this corner. And it's a long line down, so that's a stop there. And I've said I've rearranged the shadows and rocks here a little bit. And I'm going to rearrange the boats, but I'm going to talk about that tomorrow. And the purpose will be to just sort of create more of an arc for your eye to get from here to here. So those are a couple of ideas, and I don't know if you could ask more specific, ask that question a little bit more specifically. Maybe I could be a little bit more specific in my answer.
We'll discuss it tonight and tomorrow we can address anything.
Sure. Okay, so just reworking the drawing of this rock ever so slightly.
There's a comment from Marcus Nix saying, just want to say thank you for the wonderful session today. It was great and very useful. So we're coming up on 10 minutes left.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
No way. Well, Marcus, thanks for watching. I don't know how it feels for you, but I'm surprised it's almost over. So this is going to be a 9-hour demo. So we're about a third of the way through. I'm going to leave that. That's a little too light. But I think the way that I'll resolve that tomorrow, after it's set up a little bit, is just glaze over it. So tomorrow, the next day, I should be able to glaze over that. I'll show you how I do that. So make it a little bit darker. And whenever you glaze, I discovered this working on a large figurative piece, actually. You create a color that you just cannot, if you're mixing opaque paint, you can't, it just gives you a little bit more of a range and a lot more interest. So I'm gonna leave it like that, just softening that edge as it rounds. Well, as it goes around, it's more like this. That's the shape of the thing. And that works for me too. But that's too light, just so you know, I know that. And I'll fix it tomorrow. So tune in tomorrow or the next day, not sure. Okay, so in the last few minutes, let's see. Well, just to continue with what I'm doing here, I think I'd like to get a little bit more texture that I can work over tomorrow, where the shallow still water meets the seaweed and rocks and sand here. So it's wet and violet and just something to work with here. This is where maybe I can sneak in my great big knife. Huh. And the thing, whenever you have something that gives you a strong technique, like a tool like this, the goal is just, for me, I always want people to see my painting before they see my painting technique. So that's something to keep in mind, the term that I've always heard for paintings where like you look at it and you're like, oh, they used a palette knife. That's a sort of a technique-y painting. So I like to have the mark making subdued enough, and again, to use that idea of mysterious enough, so that it's not, I don't want it to be abundantly clear what kind of tool I used. Just, I want it to be obvious that it wasn't just some sort of straightforward brush stroke, but not obvious how I achieved it. So that's one of the reasons I switched tools around. That's one of the things I'm looking for in texture. And to try to mask my process. And I think that's really, and you think about looking at wildlife, looking at the nature, looking at, I can't talk, excuse me, looking at the landscape, looking at nature. Unless you're very specialized in your field, you know almost nothing about what you're looking at. You know, all the little mysteries, all the little kingdoms that you're seeing when you just look across a scene. So I think that's why mystery, a sort of a mysterious process, lends itself to representational painting, because the thing that we're painting is fairly mysterious. And it's good to have it that way. And again, looking at my plein air, I can see this beautiful sort of yellowish, I don't know if I use yellow paint or if I use Viridian there. I think I will add a little cadmium, well, it's not cadmium lemon, excuse me, it's Hansa yellow light. Until very recently, I used all these bright yellows and reds were cadmiums, and I've switched to different colors that are not toxic or dangerous at all. At least that's my understanding. And they're also cheaper and more colorful. So the only problem, so I switched from all of my blues and greens to phthalos, phthalo green, phthalo emerald, phthalo blue. And I just was having trouble getting that sort of gray harmony that I love to get in my work. So I switched back, and so far I'm happy with the combination between these modern pigments here, the Naphthol Scarlet, and then my Hansa Yellows, and then my trusty old blues and greens. I really love what's happening here. This is great. And we've talked about composition, questions about composition. So now that I have this rock here, I don't know if I like it. So it's in my source, right? And I think it was submerged when I painted my plein air sketches. But it's in the photograph, and so it made it into my composition study. But now that it's there, I don't think that it really, at least in its present state, it doesn't really help my composition. So composition is something that changes throughout. So I'm just going to knock it down a little bit, and I think I'll like that better. Yes, I will.
So TJ, we're out of time now, so you can go ahead and do your closing. And
So I have to stop. All right. Well, so this is a strong start for me, and I'm going to be able to take this over the next 2 days, and the goal is to bring it all the way to a finish. So what I would call a finished painting and sign. And you can see that I've started to establish a lot more texture on my surface. That's going to be great to work over. But this is, I'm really excited for tomorrow. I hope you are too. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for joining. Thank you for watching. So that's how we'll close out the day.